fueron los dos en español, entonces este tercer panel lo voy a estar moderando en inglés. Así que sí les pido a quienes necesiten que por favor elijan el canal de español para que puedan seguir las intervenciones. So, as we did yesterday, today we will address the issue of how to prevent and reduce the misuse of the emergency number. And just to make sure, Lori and Holly, this panel, because yesterday the two panels, we did them in Spanish. This panel, at least the moderation will be in English, okay? Cristina, lo puedes hacer en español, vos tranquila, pero me pareció que estaba bueno como complementar un poquito y hoy hacerlo en inglés, ¿está? Así que bueno, as I was saying, the topic on which we will be working today is the same as yesterday. It's how to prevent and reduce the misuse of the emergency number. Yesterday, the geographical scope of both panels covered Latin America, both at the national and at the subnational level. But today, we will position ourselves on what is known as the global north, showcasing the experiences of Canada, of the United States, and Europe. So as with the two panels yesterday, this panel will also be structured into 3 parts. And just let me show you briefly the parts in which we have broken down this panel for you. Just let me know whether you are seeing the presentation. Yes?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Ana Carolina. So in the first panel, panelists will provide a current assessment, a state of affairs of misuse of the emergency number at the national level in both of the cases of Canada and the United States, and at the regional level in the case of Europe. Then, in the second part of the panel, panelists will share some of the strategies that have been implemented to address this issue. And in the third part of the panel, we will open up for questions. So, in preparation for that third part of the panel, we will ask participants to start leaving your questions in the Zoom, in the chat Zoom, so that we are ready for that Q&A session when it arrives. We will be responsible for collecting, organizing, and systematizing the questions. And when the time comes, we will pose those questions to the panelists. In the fourth part of the panel, we will ask panelists to share with us their final comments, their final thoughts about the topic. And to address this 4-part panel, I have the great honor to share this panel with 3 experienced and talented ladies. Holly Barkwell, she's president and CEO of Barkwell Holland Group Incorporated, and she's also NINA Canadian Region Director and member of APCO Canada. Also joining us today is Cristina Lumbreras. She's the technical director of INA. And finally, Lori Anderson, who, in addition to her position as 911 manager at the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office in Florida, she is also NINA's board president. So, as you can see, we have an amazing lineup for this first morning panel. So for the first round of presentations, I will ask Holly to provide a general overview or assessment of this problem in Canada. So please, Holly, go ahead. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Karen. You should be able to now see my screen. Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here to talk to you about the Canadian experience with regards to misuse. So just a little bit about Canada. We are the forgotten country on top of the US, the land of snow and ice, as everyone likes to call us. We have approximately 37 million people. in Canada, which is small in terms of some other countries. We have the longest land border in the world and almost the longest seaboards on both coasts as well. From a land mass perspective, we are just under 10 million kilometers squared. We are, in fact, the second largest country in the world after Russia. More than half the lakes in the world are in Canada, and just over 66% of Canadians live within 100 kilometers of the border. So that creates some opportunities and some challenges in terms of public safety across the country. I'm going to be speaking about the national perspective because that's how we prefer to refer to things in Canada. So in terms of public safety, we have approximately 250 primary and secondary PSAPs, or public safety answering points, in the country. We have approximately 110 primary, and what that means is 911 calls, all 911 calls, landline and cellular, are directed to a primary PSAP first based on location of the caller. And from there, they are either dispatched internally or directed to another agency for dispatch. So those are referred to as secondary PSAPs. We have approximately 140 of those across the country. We started 2 years ago, we had approximately 330, but we have now downsized or consolidated to approximately 250. And part of that is because we are in the midst of a transition to an IP-based infrastructure over the analog. And that's the reduction in centers is due to, sadly, the cost of the transition is very expensive. And we are also facing the same critical staffing shortages that most of the rest of the world is experiencing, and agencies just aren't able to deliver the service levels that they feel citizens deserve. Our regulator has mandated, so the thing that we've done a little bit differently in Canada is our regulator, which is the Canadian Radio, Television, Telecommunications Commission, or the CRTC, set out some rulings a few years ago and has mandated that all PSAPs in Canada be NG911 enabled by March 4th of 2025. So we are in the midst of a huge infrastructure change, which has is causing some challenges for us. A little bit of history on our regulatory environment. We have no federal oversight for public safety. This responsibility is dedicated to the province and territories. Canada has 13 provinces and territories currently. As I mentioned, our national regulator is the CRTC. They are responsible for the carriers, or the incumbent local exchange carriers. So they have oversight or governance authority over the networks. They do not have governance authority over public safety agencies, so the networks that serve the agencies. So they regulate how service is provided, and this is how they in fact enacted the change. Is they required the telecommunications carriers or the 911 service providers to make specific changes within their network to switch to IP, which by definition compels the agencies or the public safety agencies to make those changes as well in order to stay connected to the network. So the 911 carriers are required to migrate to IP from analog, and therefore the PSAPs are required to follow suit. I mentioned we have 13 provinces and territories. Public safety in Canada is delegated to the province to manage, which makes federal oversight difficult. So we have kind of a mixed bag, if you will, of how public safety is regulated across the country. So some provinces and territories have adopted legislation in the form of a 911 Act, which allows the province to collect a levy or a surcharge on phone lines that includes landline and cell phone by the province to help fund the PSAPs, encourage adoption of standards and best practices, and assist with technology and infrastructure maintenance and improvement. So it also acts as a mechanism to not so much enforce, but encourage compliance by the PSAPs, because in order to apply for funding, they have to meet certain criteria. So they need to be audited, in some cases every 2 to 3 years. They need to prove that their call taking and dispatch staff are trained according to minimum standards. And they have to have other things in place, such as quality assurance and quality improvement programs. However, this is, again, it's a provincial decision, so it's not across the board, which causes issues. So we have training. So those things apply to training, service levels, some policy and procedures for interacting with other agencies, and provincial reporting. So each province or territory is responsible for defining their individual reporting policies, practices, and procedures. This creates a significant gap because depending on staffing levels at the PSAPs, some people or some agencies are well staffed and have allocated positions to do these, to fill these functions, others do not. The ones that don't have staff allocated fall short in reporting. Some of them have better tools than others, some have no tools at all. So currently we do not have a national requirement or consensus for collecting statistics on 911 misuse reporting. However, individual PSAPs in many cases maintain some form of reporting. And they are PSAPs across the country, as we are shifting into the IP environment, are increasingly voluntarily adopting standards and best practices for things like PSAP, construction of PSAP facilities, configuration in terms of technology, function, survivability for weather events, how the centers operate, call handling also, and data management. So the entities that we, that are most, well, they're globally recognized, but the ones that are most often followed are NENA, the National Fire Protection Association, the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, and what am I missing? And APCO, sorry, I'm not sure why I missed that one. APCO was in there as well. And I think for the first part, I will probably stop there and turn it back.
I think, Holly, it would be good if you could also tell us about the classification and categories.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So we don't have the class. What we don't have across the country right now is a common definition or understanding of what different types of calls are. So agencies vary greatly, but in front of you right now is a list of the most common ones. So we have classified misdials. So vexatious calls are what we term for intentional misuse, people that are trying to flood the system for a joke, or you know, we don't. That's not mental health related issues. That's intentional misuse of 911. Then we have issues with automated dialers. I'm not sure what it's called elsewhere, but Ford Sync has an in-car system that automatically dials 911. Apple has recently introduced their fall and crash notification detection and alerting systems. And there are a series of others as well. Now this has caused a problem because certain provinces and territories in Canada have legislation that specifically prohibits the delivery of automated notifications directly into 911. However, these companies are large. They've gone out and done their due diligence. And when they have, when they were first introduced, the public safety community in Canada was outraged, contacted them all and held meetings, and they basically came back and said, we've done our due diligence, we're doing it anyway. So there's really no recourse. The legislation that we have in place isn't effective in preventing that. So we've had to adapt and accommodate and figure out how we're dealing with these things. So agencies are doing it on a regional basis and by talking to each other and sharing. We also have pocket dials, unintentional calls. So test calls, people that are calling to make sure the system is working for wherever they're situated. Then we have dropped calls and hangups. So drop calls are calls that either don't reach a telecommunicator or hung up, or they don't just after they reach the switch, and they don't come in with any alley information. So there's no location, no callback information. And then we have, of course, hangups. If people get left in the queue too long, or they've unintentionally dialed, they hang up. So there are a number of others, but these are the ones that tend to be more common across the country.
Yes, and I guess, Holly, because you don't have like a standardized classification and categories across Canada, you cannot have like the total and then the total disaggregated by type.
Correct.
Like, remember, as yesterday, a couple of the systems were able to do that kind of analysis.
And that's a massive gap that we have, that we recognize across the country. And the hopes are that once we transition to the IP platform, that's one of the first items on the list, is to come to some common understanding of what variables are so we can start tracking it.
Great, Holly. Do you want to continue, or?
I'll pause there,
Okay,
because I think we go into the next section
great.
after.
Perfect then. So thank you, Holly, for that first part. And now let's move to Europe. I wish I were there, Christina, with you, but I'm here.
Yes, I'm here.
So let's go ahead and listen from you about what is the state of affairs or the state of situation regarding this problem in Europe. Thank you so much.
Un momento.
Y esta presentación, aprovecho, esta presentación la tenemos en español. Esta presentación todavía no está traducida en inglés. We haven't yet translated this presentation into English, but we'll work on it this afternoon.
Creo que ya está. ¿Podéis verla? Vale, gracias.
Perfecto.
Buenos días a todos. Para mí es buenas tardes. Estoy en Bruselas, en Bélgica. Soy de Madrid, de España, pero bueno, ya hace muchos años que vivo en Bélgica. Soy la directora técnica de ENA, que es la European Emergency Number Association, y estoy encantada de tener esta oportunidad de participar en este conversatorio sobre el mal uso del número de emergencia. Y bueno, voy a hacer una pequeña introducción de lo que es ENA. Somos una asociación sin ánimo de lucro. Nació nuestra asociación en 1999 y, bueno, y nuestras oficinas están en Bruselas, en Bélgica. Tenemos más de 1.500 miembros de organizaciones públicas de todo el mundo. Empezamos muy focalizados en Europa, pero la verdad es que ahora tenemos también miembros de otras partes del mundo, de más de 80 países. Trabajamos con más de 100 organizaciones privadas y también con universidades y europarlamentarios. Y nuestros objetivos son tres. Primero, la divulgación de información, compartir mejores prácticas o innovaciones o qué está pasando en los distintos países. Facilitar los contactos entre países, porque al principio, cuando se creó ENA, pues en Europa no había contactos entre países. Cada uno pensaba que prácticamente los problemas que tenía eran suyos y solamente suyos, y luego se descubrió que todo el mundo tenía más o menos los mismos problemas. Y luego pues impulsar el cambio pues compartiendo toda esta información. Hay pues países que dicen, ahí va, pues esto me puede interesar mucho, lo implemento, o entre todos intentamos ver cómo poder innovar. Para eso pues tenemos distintas plataformas, tenemos la divulgación de distintos documentos, también tenemos una gran conferencia anual, que este año será en abril en Ljubljana, en Eslovenia, que todo el mundo está invitado a participar, por supuesto, y otros también participamos en proyectos de innovación pues en distintos aspectos de tecnología, más operativos. Estas son básicamente las vías que tenemos para alcanzar nuestros objetivos. Entonces, para este tema concreto, tenemos una publicación que es False Emergency Calls, que la publicamos en septiembre del 2020 en su última versión, pero viene de un trabajo anterior del 2011. Entonces, en este documento, pues voy a hacer un resumen de un poco de las conclusiones que sacamos de este estudio. Y también otro documento que quería resaltar es el documento de Emergency Silent Hang Up and Abandoned 112 Calls, que también, aunque no es directamente sobre false calls, pero está muy relacionado, ya que hacemos pensamos cómo se puede resolver el tema tan difícil de cuando tenemos una llamada abandonada o una persona que ha colgado, que se puede hacer. Entonces, en Europa, bueno, hablaba mi colega de Canadá que tenían muchas regiones, que cada uno pues, tenía su propia clasificación. En Europa, y bueno, estoy hablando de la Unión Europea porque no toda Europa está dentro de la Unión Europea, pero dentro de la Unión Europea hay ya 27 países, cada país tiene su legislación y luego dentro de muchos países también hay regiones, que cada una tiene también muchos países, como por ejemplo en España o en Bélgica, tienen la competencia del 112 por región. Entonces, pues la diversidad de formas de organizarse es enorme y también la diversidad de qué es una llamada falsa pues es distinta en unos sitios que en otros. Entonces en ENA intentamos hacer una clasificación que pudiese ser aceptable para todo el mundo y llegamos a la conclusión después de muchas teleconferencias y debates en clasificarlas por una parte las no intencionadas y por otra parte las intencionadas. Es decir, las no intencionadas son pues la persona que está realizando esta llamada no es consciente de que no es de que está realizando una llamada de emergencia que no es realmente de emergencia, y las intencionadas sí que es cuando la persona es consciente de que está haciendo algo que no es correcto. Entonces, dentro de las no intencionadas, como una de las más subcategorías destacadas, las más destacadas son las llamadas de bolsillo, pues sin querer el llamante realiza, vamos, el teléfono sin tener en cuenta la persona realiza la llamada y se produce una llamada al 112 involuntaria totalmente y la persona no está tampoco atenta a lo que le está diciendo el operador del 112. Tenemos aquí una no intencionada intervención. Otra solución, otra subcategoría sería el juicio inapropiado de la situación. Es algo para que la persona es una emergencia total, pero realmente para el sistema de emergencia no lo es. Por ejemplo, se me han olvidado las llaves y estoy en la puerta de casa y no puedo entrar. Pues es una gran emergencia para mí, pero para el resto del mundo pues no se considera una emergencia porque no está en juego la seguridad ni la vida de nadie. Luego también, también son las llamadas realizadas automáticamente por dispositivos. Ya se ha mencionado pues, los smartphones que tienen ahora algunas funcionalidades de llamada automática por caída o por un accidente de coche. Cada vez hay más funcionalidades de este tipo. Y en Europa también tenemos lo que llamamos el e-call, que es obligatorio ya desde hace unos años, que es que los vehículos, los nuevos modelos de vehículo que se van adquiriendo por las personas, los nuevos coches, tengan instalado una tecnología que en caso de accidente realiza una llamada automática al 112, puede ser automática o puede ser también con un botón SOS de emergencia. Desafortunadamente se están recibiendo bastantes llamadas falsas de estos e-calls y ha incrementado el porcentaje de llamadas falsas recibidas por los centros de emergencia. Luego es otro problema que era más en antiguas tecnologías de telefonía, pero que bueno, sigue siendo, es que automáticamente, sin saberlo muy bien por qué, la red de telefonía marca el 112 y se recibe una llamada sin sonido en el 112. Y luego pues la manipulación errónea del terminal, que es pues sin querer alguien pulsa la llamada de emergencia. Y luego ya en las intencionadas, pues es personas que llaman para una información sabiendo que realmente el 112 es el número de emergencia, bromas que puede ser por parte de niños o no tan niños, pues como es gratis, es gratuito en la llamada, pues para divertirse y reírse. También hay personas con enfermedades psiquiátricas que llaman reiteradamente, que esto pues en algunos países sí que se considera en cierto modo una emergencia, o en otros no, porque hay una persona detrás que tiene un problema, que a lo mejor no es una emergencia real para su vida, que esté en peligro, pero sí que hace falta una atención detrás de esto. Luego las ofensivas, que son para insultar a la persona que está detrás del teléfono. Y luego las que son más difíciles de saber si son realmente una broma o si son llamadas que tienen detrás una emergencia o no, son cuando una persona describe una situación de emergencia que no es real, que se la está inventando. O sea, por ejemplo, hay fuego en mi casa y realmente no hay fuego, pero es muy difícil tomar la decisión de esta persona me está mintiendo o no. Cuando se llama al 112, pero algunas veces no, llega a la que es la cola de llamadas, pero cuelgan, que no se sabe si es porque se han equivocado y han colgado inmediatamente o porque han tenido que colgar porque estaban en una situación de X y ya les han obligado a colgar. Y luego las llamadas silenciosas, que son unas llamadas que no se oye nada al otro lado del teléfono y no se sabe si es porque la persona no es consciente de que ha llamado al 112 o porque realmente está inconsciente y no puede hablar, o está en una situación de peligro y tampoco puede hablar. Y bueno, quería compartir también con vosotros un poco los números de porcentaje de llamadas de emergencia falsas. No hay estadísticas de tipo por tipo, en algunos países las hay, pero así a nivel europeo no hay esta clasificación de si son intencionadas, no intencionadas. Entonces esto en el global pues se puede ver que hay mucha diferencia entre los países. Desde Lituania, que está a un 1% de las llamadas recibidas al 112 son llamadas de mal uso, frente a Grecia, que son casi, el 78%. Estos son datos del 2020, que están publicados por la Comisión Europea sobre pues, el mal uso del teléfono 112. Entonces, detrás se puede ver también que es a lo mejor también un tema muy cultural, muy de distintos, también si hay otros números de emergencia, porque en Europa en algunos países no solo es el 112, sino que también hay números de emergencia nacionales. Hay varios factores que hacen esta diferencia, pero realmente, hombre, la media está más o menos en el entre el 36, bueno, 35 o 40%, que vamos a decir que son los que están en el medio, España, Holanda, Hungría, Italia, pues es un montón, es casi, es un porcentaje muy, muy alto. ¿Y cuáles son las medidas que se toman en general para paliar este gran número de llamadas falsas? Pues en primer lugar es intentar
Perdón,
educar.
Cristina,
Sí, dime.
esto ya va a centrar como a la parte de soluciones, ¿no?
Sí,
O
¿lo hago ahora o después?
después, así ahora vamos a Estados Unidos a escuchar un poquito a ver cuál
Vale,
es la situación en
estupendo.
Estados Unidos, pero
Muy bien.
aprovecho, perdón, que soy moderadora y te voy a preguntar rápidamente si los números que nos acabas de compartir son realmente comparables o justamente por no haber una clasificación estandarizada tenemos el mismo problema que en Canadá, que en realidad sí es mal uso, pero en ese mal uso hay como diferentes tipos, ¿no? de
Yo creo,
llamadas. O sea,
lo
¿cuán
que
comparable es los números?
son bastante comparables porque básicamente es si hay un despacho de recursos o no hay un despacho de recursos. Lo único que sí que hay diferencias en la definición, sobre todo si, por ejemplo, una persona llama para una enfermedad que no es una emergencia crítica para la vida. En algunos países lo consideran como buen uso, porque mejor es que realice la llamada para atenderla cuanto antes, pero en otros países lo consideran mal uso, porque no es realmente una emergencia con peligro para la vida.
Listo, Cristina, gracias por esa aclaración y aprovecho para decirles a los y a las participantes que la publicación que nos mencionaba Cristina, la de False Emergency Calls, en su versión 2.0, ya está en la comunidad SES, ya les compartimos el enlace en el chat, y lo que sí vamos a hacer, Cristina, es a partir de la recomendación es subir también la de Emergency Silent, Hang Up and Abandoned 1112 Calls, porque sí creo que está relacionado y bueno, es importante también que la gente tenga acceso a esa publicación. Así que hoy en el transcurso de la tarde vamos a subir esa publicación a la comunidad SES para que todos tengan acceso. Bueno, muchas gracias Cristina, y lo que vamos a hacer ahora es, we're going to go to the US, and so for that I will cede the floor to Lori Anderson to learn about Nina's assessment of this problem with regards to the US.
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. It's times like these that I wish that I had continued my Spanish education many years ago. I'd actually like to be able to deliver it in Spanish, but that's not going to happen today. So, Karen, thank you for bringing up my presentation for me. We were having a few difficulties, so I'll go ahead and get right into the topic, which, misuse of 911 obviously comes in a variety of forms. And each one is handled, maybe handled just slightly differently based on the individual state and or local capabilities and policies. Some of the more serious ones that we deal with from time to time are swatting incidents. Swatting is a form of harassment where a caller will call 911 or the communication center and generates an emergency call to typically target an individual or a group of people, and making a false call, making false statements against an individual. Some of the problems that happen out of this, they can cause a great deal of harm, not only to the person that they're targeting, but also to our responders. We have to be very cautious of these types of calls, and it seems like they are becoming more frequent. We just had one in September of 2021. I went ahead and shared with you a link for an incident that we had recently. But these are very serious types of incidents. They don't happen all the time, but these are some more of your egregious types of calls. We also have the telephony denial of service attacks, where, as Holly mentioned before, and other countries experience the same types of things, that they overload the phone system with calls where we cannot actually bring in our own 911 calls that are they're actual true emergencies. And they're called TDOS attacks, and they may be at a very low level up to a very high level. Some of the low level ones are where they can be handled by the dispatch center and by the personnel that are there. And they can actually make, other calls can actually make it into the system. But to a very large level, they can completely lock up the 911 system where you can't retrieve any calls whatsoever. Another type of attack is going to be the ransomware, where it's malicious software that's designed to block access to computers and phone systems until ransom money is paid for it. Again, these are some very serious types of incidents. They do happen, and they are dealt with individually based on the types of technology that's available and what we can actually do at our own centers. Some other intentional types are calls to intentionally make a false report. Then we also have calls to intentionally harass either 911 center personnel or even the road units to be able to get some type of a response. Some of these can be what are considered from sovereign citizens who feel that laws do not apply to them. The callers are sometimes vulgar and demeaning to anyone that answers the call, and they can continue to make these phone calls. If an operator tries to disconnect the call, they will immediately call back. Occasionally, these individuals are under the influence of some type of alcohol or drugs. So obviously their thinking is not very clear in what it is that they're doing. Some of the more common forms of misuse of the 911 system are unintentional calls. And there's sometimes those people that are uneducated on how to use the system or even how to use the device that they're calling from. Now that they are finding or implementing new ways to reach 911 through different types of devices, we're finding that there are more false calls or people that just don't know how to use the device that they're calling from. So they accidentally make 911 calls. There's also different understandings of what an emergency is. In a particular area that I live in might be different than somewhere on the other side of the United States. It means different things to different people and in different situations. My emergency is not always going to be somebody else's emergency. So we have to take that into an account too. We can't just dismiss and say that it's not an emergency, call back on another number, because to them, they are truly experiencing a crisis. And, regardless what that may be. We also have some people that have different intellectual capabilities and have no understanding at all of how the system works. These are not very frequent, but they do happen. We also have telemarketers that are dialing our 10-digit lines that are associated, they're 10-digit numbers that are associated with the 911 lines. And these telemarketers, they get these telephone numbers and they don't realize that they're making them. And I'll just tell you just a little bit of experience that we had. It took me 2 years to be able to finally get these change the phone numbers out with the carriers. And where we could stop the telemarketers from calling in. We were getting calls from Amazon and from insurance companies, and we tell them, hey, take this number off your list, but often they don't even know what number is on their list because they're using a service, and it's automatically dialing those numbers, and then as soon as they reach somebody, the telemarketer is put on the phone, so they don't even know what numbers are being called. And again, it took probably 2 years to be able to get this figured out and get it fixed for our area. So it does present a big problem. It's problematic. So then there's all the more common form is your accidental and abandoned calls. There are a high number of accidental calls. They could be somebody that accidentally hits their phone because they're rooting around in their purse, or they've got it in their back pocket. We've had plenty of calls related to vehicle accidents on major highways, and everyone calls in, or a lot of people will call in, and then when they realize that maybe somebody else is calling in, they hang up. Instead of staying on the line to make sure that we've received their information or that we can acknowledge them, they hang up, meaning that now we have to call them back. We have to make contact with them, and that also ties up some of our resources to be able to do that, especially in very large scale incidents. Okay, we can move on to the next slide, Karen. Thank you. And one thing I want to address here too is, we talk about the misuse of specifically 911 or those 911 lines, but there are also other telephone lines that are used in the communication center for critical public safety communication that may not necessarily be the 911 line that a caller calls in on. And these non-emergency lines, it can be very problematic when people misuse these numbers, and it can be more difficult to address as well. Often these lines are used to transfer emergency calls to other locations. We use these lines for mutual aid resources and, for major incidents. These lines are often used by carriers for default routing. So if they can't reach 911, they'll default route to an administrative line. And if these lines are compromised in any way, it prevents us from being able to perform those critical activities that are done in a 911 center. So I just wanted to address that too, that even though we talk about those specific 911 lines, there are other lines that are critical to the public safety system that can also become compromised and misused as well. An example of that now is that even at my center, we've had over 300 calls in a matter of a week of someone utilizing or calling over and over and over again on this administrative line just to harass our communication center. That is problematic because these lines are also used to make calls out to these other entities, to other agencies, whether we need a medical helicopter to respond to an incident. It makes it difficult to perform these activities when these lines are being misused. So abandoned calls in Florida, where I live, the result, it's about an average of 10% of the call volume. Right now, the national statistics on these types of calls are unknown because we don't collect this data nationally or have a mechanism in place to be able to collect that data. I think I probably have it somewhere else further down in my presentation, but we are a federation of states, and each state has that ability to be able to make many of their own laws and collect the data as they see where it's needed. And some states do this and some states don't. I would say that Florida is not one of them. They, we collect data as it pertains to the amount of 911 calls, whether they're being used for its landline calls, cellular calls, text to 911 calls, those types of things. But we don't collect data as it pertains to the misuse of the system. Each center may experience different things, and they deal with those things as they come. Why a call was abandoned is not always known. We have accidental abandoned calls that take up the valuable resources. Policies to address some of these issues are differ across agencies. For example, when we have an abandoned 911 call here, we make every attempt that we can to reach the caller. We try them at least 2 times. If they don't answer, we have to send, if we have a location provided to us, we have to send a law enforcement response to make sure that whoever it is that attempted to call 911 actually received some type of assistance. However, that may not be the same in all cases. Let's see, PSAP staffing is a national problem. It's actually, it's a worldwide problem. Communication centers just don't have the people to be able to answer the call volume that they're receiving. They're just seriously understaffed. So we're trying to find ways that we can to reduce the amount of call volume to the best that we can. And moving on to the next slide, that next slide was just a slide regarding the fact that we don't keep national statistics, and every state has the ability, like I said, to be able to create their own laws when it comes to the misuse. And from what the research that I have found, there's less than 50% of our states that actually has a misuse of 911 law in place. And some of these laws may even vary to severity. Most of them make them a crime where they may either receive a fine or even some type of time in jail, or where they're incarcerated. Multiple repeat offenses may have different or increased sanctions applied to them. There's also varying practices from one PSAP to the next. In some areas of the country, they may accept some types of calls on 911, where in others they may not. Calls may be seen as an emergency, and then, or calls that may not be seen as an emergency may be directed to an administrative line. So they call on 911, they determine, the call taker at the time determines this isn't an emergency, please call a non-emergency number. They provide them with a telephone number. But at the same time, that same person is answering both those emergency calls and those non-emergency calls. So now they've just created additional work for themselves. So sometimes they just go ahead and answer the calls anyway on 911. There would be, sometimes to them, it's just no point in redirecting them somewhere else when they're going to have to answer that call anyway. But what we have to understand is the things that we allow and that we continue to accept are going to become the norm. People get used to it. It's what, they're going to answer us anyway. So we're just going to, we can go ahead and make those calls on 911. So we have to take some of these things into consideration. And not to mention, it's just, when we start talking about some of the staffing in the 911 centers, that to me, it's kind of crazy that, somebody might even be put on hold on 911, but it does happen in some of the larger cities. So for somebody else that lives in that larger city, something that might be the norm to them, but to me, it's not, because I live in a much smaller area that, just doesn't have that same type of call volume. So a lot of these terms that we talked about for the misuse of 911 are commonly understood across the country, but may not necessarily be classified in the same way. We don't have a specific criteria that classifies these calls that across the country. Some agencies or some states may collect data using computer-aided dispatch programs, and some states may have reporting requirements while others don't. It's very hard to tell who has them and who doesn't. So I think that's where I think I can stop for now.
Okay, Lori.
Before we
So
move on to the next.
yeah. So I'll stop here. Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you.
And just 2 quick questions for you.
Okay.
So now wearing your hat as Nina,
Okay.
I wanted to know whether there are any standards or any guidelines as to when you talk about call handling, whether in those standards or in those guidelines for call handling, you have anything regarding what to do with either abandoned calls or accidental calls, if there are any guidelines that not only the US, but that other countries could use.
Right. NINA has a whole suite of standards, and some of those are PSAP, dealing in PSAP operations, also for the technology aspect of it, and how to prevent certain types of calls using technology. There's a blocking call standard. There's a spoofing standard. There is, so if you go to nina.org, there is a whole suite of standards that are available to anyone that want to use them. And we encourage our telecommunications and our PSAPs to utilize these standards to develop their own policies on what they'll do in their own agencies. It's basically a guide for them to use.
Okay, perfect, Lori. Thank you for that. I think that what we are going to do is we're going to go over that list and make a pre-selection and send it over to you just to check whether we are sharing the correct suite of standards with the community. Is that okay with you?
That's perfectly fine.
Okay, great. And then the second question is, do you think that the National 911 program here in the US at the DOT could somehow start at least voluntary, like each agency to start sharing the data and to start working on a common classification from the National 911 program? Do you think that this would be something feasible to do?
Well, it's certainly something that we can address with the National 911 office and request to start seeking ways to make this happen. I just don't know what their staffing and it looks like, and what their capabilities to even to be able to collect this data are. I can't speak for them, but I've learned an awful lot out of this panel, and it's given me some takeaways that I can go and share with other people to be able to make those data-driven decisions.
Great. Thank you, Lori, for those answers and for this first intervention. And so we will now continue to the second part of the panel. In that regard, I will ask Holly to share with us some of the strategies, actions, and measures that have been implemented in Canada to try to address this problem. So please, Holly, go ahead.
Okay. And everyone can see my screen again? All right. So the first step, again, because we have various best practices across the country, we've tried, or agencies on a regional level are trying to address or come to some common data dictionary definitions or terms of reference for common statistics. So we can begin to commonize terminology and definitions, at least from a regional perspective, and then hopefully we can translate that into provincial and maybe national. Currently, agencies are downloading stats from either 911 service provider reporting system, individual PBX reporting tools, or they've developed custom reporting tools that they pick information, as Lori mentioned, from their CAD systems or RMS or wherever they're taking it from. increasingly, we're also seeing third-party integrators or software providers are starting to develop interfaces to capture this kind of information and to begin reporting on it. But again, it's all individual agency based. There is no commonality or sharing on a large scale. One thing, a couple of slides I missed in the last portion regarding quality control. So from a national perspective, we just don't have any of that right now when it comes to misuse. We have lots of quality controls. NINA has a standard for PSAP operations and specifically for quality assessment, quality improvement. Many agencies in Canada, because of the critical staffing nature, if they had programs in place, they are behind or they've been dropped off to the side. They simply don't have the people to be maintaining them. So they have them for mainly for PSAP operations to make sure that the quality of service is realistic. So again, the reporting differs between service providers and the metrics definitions differ. We do compare stats across the country. We have a couple. So what we've done, we have a group in Canada that's called the Emergency Services Working Group, and they work under the jurisdiction of the CRTC or on behalf of to address different technology issues that affect 911 across the country. So we have a couple of reference agencies that we deal with that seem to reflect, or at least the agencies that participate on the Emergency Services Working Group is a collaborative work group of approximately 400 public safety professionals across the country. So they weigh in on different things. So we have what are called technical identification forms. So these are issues that are brought to the CRTC's attention that they ask ESWG to address from a technology perspective. So we have a couple of agencies across the country that we poll for stats that are willing to share the information, particularly on misuse and misdials and the various definitions. And so what one task we attempted in the last few years was to come to, if not a number for a statistical number, at least a percentage of volume from a national perspective, how much of a total call volume is misuse. And then what we did was we took a number of agencies that actually provided some of their information, and we came to a consensus on what the national average actually is for false calls, and it seems to range somewhere between 20 and 30% of calls. So that's literally the best information that we have at this point on false calls or misuse. So NINA and APCO developed a joint quality improvement standard for PSAP performance and evaluation, but not for reporting. But it's encouraged that agencies adopt this, and increasingly across the country, some agencies are. So again, we don't have at this time a consistent national reporting system or format, and everything differs by province and territory. Regarding training, standards and best practices are increasingly being voluntarily adopted across the country. Lori already mentioned NINA has published dozens of technical and operational standards, including the NINA STA 020.1, published in 2020 for 911 call processing. And that is operational processes and procedures, and helps maintain quality assurance as well. In Canada, the new NG911 infrastructure is based on the NINA I3 standard, and that is supported and mandated in legislation by the CRTC. So they actually have issued policy directives that all of the new emergency services IP network or ESI networks built are based on the I3 standard. And NINA and APCO telecommunicator training is also being adopted by the majority of PSAPs voluntarily now. So the costs and impacts, I mentioned approximately 20 to 30% of calls nationally are from the categories that I displayed a little bit earlier. So the misuse, vexatious. The estimates that we've gotten from the limited data set that we have are approximately 2 to 2.5 minutes per call for follow-up activity, which includes attempting to make callbacks, leaving messages, and in some cases, agencies are adopting technology solutions to help manage this. So if there is callback information available, they will send a text back with a message stating that if this is an emergency, please call back. And they leave it at that because they just don't have the resources to follow up every call. In several cases, these are equating to like 14 or 15 man days per month of estimated time to manage these because of the significant. And when you have a PSAP that has 2 or 3 seats, that's a significant drain on the resources for handling incoming calls at the time. So what are we doing? Strategies that are underway. Agencies are noticing now. We're recognizing that the delivery of service is on the verge of breaking because the staffing, the critical staffing issues are taking over everything. So recruitment is a problem. The ability to train, even if we could hire enough people to fill the positions, we don't have places to train them. And getting them operationalized is an ongoing challenge because, of course, you also have attrition happening at the same time you're trying to hire and fill. So it's a never-ending cycle. So we're starting to look heavily at technology on how to help address some of these things. A large amount of effort is spent on public education programs regarding the proper use of 911. School programs, same as many others are doing. Fire departments go into the schools. Increasingly, agencies are sending out call takers and dispatchers now to provide the other side of the coin instead of just having, you know, the handsome, good-looking firefighters show up and make it fun and games. Part of it is also trying to educate children on the 911 component, and that being a 911 call taker or dispatcher is actually a career choice, to try and build awareness of that at the same time. So targeting programs at children, adults. We've seen a significant increase in the number of calls, particularly with Apple devices. They have the ability, if you press 2 buttons on either side of the device at the same time, it automatically calls 911. Well, when people drop their phone in the cup holders, that in many cases is triggering the calls to 911 or intentional calls. So there's some education going on around that. Theme parks are experiencing, we had one of the members of the NINA board of directors was saying Dollyland in Tennessee, they've actually published requests that people not take their cell phones or their smart devices on the roller coasters because it's triggering the fall detection, which is generating calls to 911. The issue with the public education is that these are all locally funded programs, so they come from municipal budgets. There's no 911 funding to help with this. So it comes down to the dedication of training teams to find resources online, to take them in, customize them for their own use. So there's no real coordination. And again, that's outside of 911. So it falls to the training coordinators or the training officers to deal with that portion. And sometimes it's a little bit removed from where we need to be in terms of reporting. So again, our biggest challenge right now is no coordination at the federal level. We're looking at that with the NG 911. We recognize that 911 and public safety response, there's no longer a clear distinction between the two. They're more tightly integrated than they ever have been because the information that's going to come into the PSAP now needs to go out into the responder community. So we're advocating hard for a national coordination body, at least, or a steering committee of some sort to help standardize some of these things. Regarding penalties, there is a significant lack of appetite in Canada for prosecuting for 911 infractions. So public education, understanding and support is the preferred approach. Some municipalities, Lori had mentioned that much like the US, Canada, every municipality sets their own bylaws. Policing has their own provincial acts and penal codes based on province. So some where there is chronic misuse or abuse of the system, they have taken measures to try and curb that with specific individuals, but they do not publicize it. They keep it very quiet because they don't want to deter people from calling 911, which is the whole point of the system being there. They don't want people afraid to use the system. They want people to keep calling, but they do want to try and deter specific individuals that are chronic abusers. We also have similar issues with the swatting, denial of service attacks. Those are on the rise. So agencies are talking more at a technical level about issues or solutions for these. And in a lot of cases, the wireless carriers are being engaged to put in place systems to help deter, spoofing is another one where calling entities can change the caller ID that's coming in on their phone. So carriers are now obligated to put in systems to identify those calls, validate them before they are delivered to an end user. So that's helping a little bit, but of course the bad guys always outpace what the good guys can do. So it's increasing. We have concerns, of course, with the switch to the IP infrastructure that the problem is going to continue to escalate. So we are focused now on developing ways of more deeply understanding the reasons for misuse and how, what the human behavior patterns are so that we can develop better solutions. And AI is most definitely on the radar to assist with some of that down the road. We're starting to see it implemented more in crime analytics, but we're seeing pilot projects now within the CAD environment to try and operationalize some of the data more quickly for increased situational awareness. So for lessons learned, should I do this slide now or wait?
No, I think that we should wait, but
Okay.
this is, yes, this is like the highlight of your presentation. So we'll leave it for the end. And I just wanted to ask you a quick follow-up question, Holly, because you were mentioning how carriers, you were able to work with carriers to kind of identify some chronic or problematic callers. And I also wanted to ask you, because yesterday some of the panelists were saying or telling us about their work with carriers to detect these callers, but also to kind of work with them to suspend or discontinue the numbers or the lines. And I wanted to know whether in Canada you have something similar going on, and if so, whether this is something that would be undertaken by the CRTC, or if this is something that each local agency would have to address with the carriers.
So there are two components to that. The first one is from when something becomes chronic enough, it gets raised to the CRTC as a national issue. That's when they can look at it and take action. So with the increasing volume of spam, and not just for 911, but it affects citizens as well every day because the number of robocalls you get on your phone, telemarketers, et cetera. So they took action and required the carriers to assist in screening those calls, because the end user is paying the bill for every call that comes through. So for me to carry a cell phone only to have 90% of my calls spam that outrages me as a consumer. So that's where that portion of it comes. In terms of 911, unfortunately, it's up to the agencies themselves to work with their service providers to try and limit those calls, to try and identify when there is like a DDoS attack, etc., to try and determine which lines they're coming in on and maybe suspend service on those lines or block certain calls from coming in. And the unfortunate part of that is those strategies work, but they take time. So it's, you know, it can take days and weeks in some cases to identify, because if they're using spoofing on top of that, they could be coming from out of country, in which case the tactics are limited.
Okay, thank you, Holly, for that clarification. And also thank you for sharing some of the solutions, but also some of the issues that Canada is facing, particularly from the federal level, to try to address the misuse of the emergency number. So now let us hear from Christina about what INA, I think that better said, what INA members, particularly at the country level, are doing to tackle this problem. So go ahead, Christina, thank you.
Pues las medidas que están tomando los miembros de ENA son sobre todo, el primero es la educación y la comunicación sobre el buen uso del número de emergencias. Esta yo creo que es la principal y en la que más esfuerzos se llevan a cabo, porque tanto en la educación de niños, yendo a colegios o haciendo campañas de comunicación concretas hacia ellos, pero también para todo el resto de la población. Luego también está el mensaje de bienvenida. En vez de pasar directamente la llamada a una persona, a un operador, se hace, pues está usted en contacto con los servicios de emergencia. Por favor, si no es una llamada realmente de emergencia, cuelgue. También se utiliza esto, aunque no son llamadas falsas, pero también se suele utilizar si hay una gran emergencia para evitar que se colapsen las líneas, diciendo, si por ejemplo hay un gran incendio, si usted llama por el incendio de tal sitio, ya lo tenemos en cuenta. Esto no sería una llamada falsa, porque sí que está esta persona dando información sobre un suceso de emergencia, pero puede ser útil. Luego también es muy importante la cooperación con los proveedores de telecomunicaciones y de tecnología. Estamos hablando de, primero, de poder identificar quién es el llamante, tener posibilidad de bloquear la línea en caso de que esté dando problemas. Si pensamos en llamadas automáticas, esto es muy importante porque, por ejemplo, cuando hay un coche que está sin parar realizando llamadas al 112, la única forma prácticamente es bloquear, es más sencillo bloquear esta línea que intentar localizar al propietario del vehículo. Es más largo el procedimiento. Y luego también de la parte de tecnología, pues los proveedores de tecnología de los centros de emergencia, pues que estén al tanto del problema y que siempre acompañen a los centros de recepción de llamadas de emergencia para evolucionar, por ejemplo, sea soluciones de inteligencia artificial o de soluciones concretas para un centro de emergencias concreto, porque también cada uno tiene sus propias características. Los procedimientos de filtrado de llamadas, pues saber si una persona es reincidente, si se puede, ya ha llamado muchísimas veces y ya se sabe que esta persona o desde este número se han recibido muchas llamadas que no son adecuadas, pues es importante el poderlas filtrar incluso antes de que lleguen al operador, y luego tener procedimientos claros para el operador, pues por ejemplo, comprobar que la dirección que se ha recibido automáticamente es la misma de la que está hablando la persona, y otros procedimientos operativos que tienen que utilizar las personas que trabajan en los centros de atención de emergencias. Luego están las multas y sanciones respaldadas por ley. Esto es muy distinto según cada país, pero sí que hay sanciones previstas en muchos de los países de la Unión Europea. Es, digamos, la ultimísima opción. Se suele ser bueno con paciente, vamos a decir, con estas personas. Primero, pues dándoles un aviso, un SMS diciendo que ya ha utilizado muchas veces este número de una forma no adecuada, etcétera, etcétera, hasta bloquearle la línea y hasta luego pues hacer multas económicas. Y luego también no permitir las llamadas sin SIM. En algunos países, o sea, en el pasado, todos los teléfonos, aunque no tuviesen SIM, podían realizar una llamada al 112 en Europa. Eso ya no es el caso en muchos de los países, porque provocaban muchas llamadas pues de prueba, o incluso teléfonos que se robaban, pues llamar al 112 y comprobar que sí funcionan. Y esto es una de las medidas que yo creo que más países han tomado. Y luego ya de parte de la más concreta de la tecnología o soluciones que pueden tener los centros de emergencia, una que es vital es la identificación del número de llamante, que aunque esté el teléfono oculto, que sea obligatorio mostrarlo cuando se realiza una llamada de emergencia, que se muestre al operador que está realizando la llamada. Automáticamente también es muy útil para saber la reincidencia, para bloquear la llamada en las medidas que he presentado anteriormente, o para hacer una rellamada en caso de que no se sepa si realmente es una emergencia o no, pues que se pueda rellamar. La localización automática también es muy importante, precisamente para detectar posibles llamadas que no son adecuadas. Contrastar si, por ejemplo, la localización del llamante recibida en un punto de la ciudad y está hablando de que está viendo humo al otro lado, que es imposible que lo esté viendo, pues es un claro índice de que no es una emergencia real. Y luego, pues si a lo mejor es un número reincidente y ya sabemos que está cerca de un colegio, bueno, en donde se encuentre también puede dar pistas de que puede ser una llamada que no tiene detrás una situación de emergencia real. El acceso al histórico del llamante, pues tener histórico de cuántas veces ha llamado esta persona. Muy importante la clasificación que hemos hablado ya anteriormente, que se lleve a cabo. Si una llamada no es un buen uso, pues marcarla como mal uso y así poder tener acceso al histórico cuando otra vez vuelva a aparecer ese número, saber que ya ha llamado varias veces haciendo un mal uso del número de emergencia. Luego hay mensajes automáticos, como puede ser el de bienvenida, o si por ejemplo ya la persona que está atendiendo la llamada ve que es una llamada falsa o de broma o que le están insultando, pues inmediatamente cuelga y redirige hacia un mensaje de voz diciendo usted está haciendo un mal uso del teléfono, ya no escucharle más a ese llamante, sino directamente mandarle a un mensaje de voz automático. O cortarle la llamada y mandarle un SMS automático. Y también las IVRs, la respuesta de voz interactiva, también pueden ser útiles en el caso de, pues otra vez, por ejemplo, si ya sabemos que de ese número han llamado 500 veces que no será una llamada real, pues en ese caso se puede introducir un mensaje aparte del que teníamos de bienvenida, de si realmente usted quiere hacer una llamada, por favor pulse 1. Sería un ejemplo práctico. Y luego la priorización en colas de llamada, pues si hay una persona reincidente, pasarla siempre al final, No es recomendable el bloquearla porque a lo mejor sí que tiene sobre todo si es un número público, sí que tiene una emergencia real, pero a lo mejor hacerle esperar un poco más o enrutarlo a una cola de llamadas. En algunos centros de emergencia hemos visto que a lo mejor hay una serie de personas más especializadas en detectar llamadas falsas o de broma. Entonces, pues se puede poner a las personas reincidentes a esta cola de operadores que tienen esta experiencia. Y luego una serie de ejemplos de cada país. Como ya he dicho, en cada país es distinto. Pero bueno, por ejemplo, con los Países Bajos pues también hacen mucho hincapié en la formación de los operadores para esa detección temprana de que son llamadas falsas. Tienen el histórico de llamadas y bueno, utiliza la localización del llamante, que eso es común a todos los países. En España, pues no sé, otro ejemplo, que no se permite la llamada sin SIM. Luego las multas y sanciones están en la legislación, pero cada una, al ser una competencia regional, cada comunidad autónoma, que se llama las regiones en España, pues tiene distinta legislación. Y luego en Suecia pues resaltan mucho las campañas de comunicación sobre el uso de emergencias y el mensaje automático para llamantes que realizan un mal uso para minimizar el tiempo que está un operador con esas personas. Y por mi parte, ya he finalizado mi presentación.
Súper, buenísimo, Cristina. Muchísimas gracias. Y aprovecho para hacerte un follow-up question que tiene que ver con cuando hablabas de los tipos de medidas y hablabas de esta gradualidad, ¿no? Del aviso, del bloqueo de línea, de multas. Quería saber si en algún país de la Unión Europea tienen la cuestión de la privación de la libertad, porque en algunos países se llega a ese extremo de, ok, ya cuando fue un mal uso insistente y grave, entonces sí se llega a la posibilidad de una privación de libertad. No sé si hay algún país en la Unión Europea que llega a ese extremo.
Yo creo que en algunos sí hay, pero otra cosa es que haya habido alguna persona que haya llegado a ese extremo, pero de memoria no sé exactamente en dónde, pero sí que hay algún país que lo puede alcanzar ese nivel.
Listo, gracias y también gracias por mostrarnos ahí como el conjunto de medidas que están en la Unión Europea implementando para tratar de paliar esta situación y particularmente por explicarnos cómo la tecnología, ¿no? puede jugar un rol fundamental en paliar este problema. Y creo que también siempre creo que está bueno ilustrar con ejemplos concretos, así que muchas gracias por haber traído los ejemplos de Países Bajos, de España y de Suecia. Así que bueno, vamos ahora, we will move now to the US, and we will ask Lori to present some of the responses that have been implemented here in the US, and whether, again, Lori, I don't know whether you can make any indication of guidelines from Nina on how to address the problem. I think that, y también, sorry, Christina, I should have asked you, and perhaps then in the Q&A, if you could also show us or indicate some of the guidelines that perhaps Ina has to address this issue. Because if we already have standards and guidelines around, it would be good for the Latin American region to get to know those instruments and see whether we can perhaps, probably some of the systems are already implementing them, but for other, perhaps at the national or subnational level, it might be good to point out what are the guidelines or standards that may be at play and may be implemented to address this topic. So let's go on now, Lori, to this second part of your presentation. Thank you. And yes, I'm going to share the screen. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I did put in when Holly mentioned the call handling standard for Nina, I went ahead and put the link in the chat, so you can share that with everyone at a later time. But that's definitely a critical standard that could be looked at. I'll also provide you with, like I said, some other standards like the call blocking standard, things that are more on the technical side. So obviously, in my mind, the most important thing that we can do really to help mitigate some of these issues is to educate ourselves. And by being on these panels like this is truly an educational experience, and is going to benefit so many people. But we need to be educating ourselves not only on the operating side, but also the technical side, and preparing ourselves, because we need to understand what our own systems are capable of, what where we're at with our 911 systems across the United States. We're in a variety of different stages, from basic 911, I'm sorry, from just E911 on to next generation 911. So everyone's at different stages, and they're transitional. So we have to truly understand our own systems and what they're capable of doing, and what we can do if if say we have a TDOS attack, or something of that nature, that we can respond to it effectively and quickly. And unfortunately, there may not always be everybody everyone may not be as educated technologically as some others, and so we may be seeking education or seeking input from other people to help us with these problems. And really, that's what NINA does too. That's why NINA creates these standards, to be able to help other people understand what their systems are capable of, and what they can do to prevent some of these misuse situations. So one of the a feature that, and Christina, I think, had even mentioned these automated features for their phone systems, and we utilize in a lot of areas what's called now the automatic abandoned callback feature, and that allows us to address certain types of calls that are hangups before the call taker had the opportunity to answer it. The system, there's a server behind the scenes that will make that call out to that abandoned caller, and will make several attempts to reach that person. If they're able to reach it, there's an automated message that will say, if you have an emergency, please press 1, however it is that you have your system set up. Please press 1 for an emergency. Please press 3 if you don't have an emergency. The pressing 3 would actually drop them from the call altogether. One response would bring them back into the communication center to be handled by an operator, or no response at all would bring them back into the communication center. And there's some different schools of thought on that locally, on using that type of a system, because some people might be in fear that somebody hitting that 3 response where they don't have an emergency, that maybe they're being forced to press that button. So, there are some concerns of liability there, but when we are dealing with staffing crisis issues that we are across the country, that we're looking for different avenues that are going to help us with the amount of call volume. And some people may opt in for some of those types of solutions. So, and each PSAP, like I said, is responsible for creating their own sets of policies, and NINA helps them by creating the standards. And there's a process, there's an entire process behind creating these standards, and they bring people from a variety of different areas throughout the country, variety of different experiences and knowledge that help build these build these standards that that are going to make it a comprehensive standard that is going to help the individual PSAPs be able to create their own policies and have a better understanding around it. So I truly encourage the use of these standards when creating policies. And then there's also individual state laws that may guide policy creation on things that you can and can't do at the local level. See, and I'm going to skip down. We're going to go over this one. Oh, yes. So let's talk about education a little bit. So we utilize a variety of different forms for education, and webinars, panels such as this are a great source of education. Obviously, there's webinars, roundtable discussions. We use local and state conferences, national conferences to be able to spread that message and to be able to educate our telecommunicators. I do have a list here. Go down. Yeah, I think that's right there. Yes, NINA standards. So this is some of the technological ones when we talk about the telephony denial of service, call blocking, spoofing mitigation. These are some very important standards, in my opinion, that you can go and reference. Okay, you can skip down to the next one. So individual states may require, I think I mentioned this before, that individual states may require some type of recording, but there's no federal requirements. So there's no real empirical data that exists. Like I said before, in the state that I live in, there's no reporting requirement. Now, we talked about before about maybe the national 911 office that can collect this data. The only problem is that typically it gets collected at the state level, and some of your state administrators are already taxed enough that they don't have the resources or the bandwidth to be able to add more tasks onto collecting any more data than they already do. So these are things that we have to take into consideration. Okay. Let's see, we can skip on to the next one, because some of these I had already addressed earlier anyway, so we can move on to the next one. Oh, that's okay. That was it. Okay, well then I think I'm done then.
Great. And Lori, just a quick question regarding because yesterday we also had some panelists talking about these automated messages, and I wanted just to have like a very, I don't know if you have any idea of how much these automatic abandoned callback systems cost. Is this an expensive technical solution? Do you have any idea? If you can unmute yourself, Lori, because you're muted.
Sorry, I would say that the cost is probably going to vary by provider.
Okay.
So you'd have to seek first of all, see if your provider even has this capability with the solution that they offer, and then, then check on the pricing of it.
Okay.
But,
Understood.
and you have to weigh out is it worth the price of paying for the technology, or to pay an additional person to sit in the seat to be able to answer each and every one of those calls?
Yep. Understood. Okay. Perfect. Thank you for that. And so with this, I think that we are ready to go to the Q&A session right now. And we did receive some very interesting questions. So I'm going to start with this question by Fernando Soto. And he addressed this question to you, Lauren, but I think that Holly and Christina can also jump in. Because he's asking about what is the experience with automated calls. And I think that each of you referred to these automated calls, like, for example, with devices such as Apple Watch. And if there's any way to kind of filter whether there is a true emergency or not, and what has been the experience in Canada, the US, or the European Union with regards to these devices. I don't know if there's any experience already recollected and systematized with regards to these devices that have the possibility of creating automated calls or not. But if so, what is the experience so far?
We here, obviously, we've had some experience with these automated calls. I don't know that it has been, for the area that I live in, it's not been problematic, but as Holly mentioned, you have places like Tennessee for Dollywood that do experience that and may have to come up with some type of a solution if it was problematic enough. I don't know that there's any way to properly filter out these types of calls. When they're presented, they look like a normal call.
Holly or Christina, do you want to add anything to that?
It's for those ones in particular, it's hard to filter out because they're either coming in on a dedicated admin line, such as in the case of Ford Sync, or for Apple Watch, it's calling 911 directly. And in those cases, usually the user is with the phone, so it connects regardless. Perhaps there has been some discussion here within groups whether an IVR type or an automated system could screen those better, that if you really want to talk to 911, press 1, but now you're adding another step in the process to contact, which is counterproductive to the purpose of 911. So nothing concrete has come out of that yet, and I think it's going to be based on somebody's going to try something and test it out, and we'll see what happens. But at this time, we don't have any concrete proof of concepts or anything that are ongoing.
Understood, Holly. Thank you, Christina.
So in Europe, I said the biggest problems are the e-calls, the calls coming from the cars. And in this case, the way it is standardized in Europe is that they use a special flag in the network, so they can be rerouted to a special queue in the PSAP, and this way they could be filtered. But for the rest of calls, like the Apple Watch or others, there's no way to filter them, as said by Laurie and Holly.
Okay, understood. And I think that at some point it might be something to address directly with Apple or with other providers of these devices. And there is a question by Marisol. The question is in Spanish, so Laurie and Holly, I'm not going to attempt to make the interpretation of this when we have professional interpreters, so make sure that you're listening to this question in English. Marisol les pregunta a las tres si pueden compartir resultados de programas de educación pública para justamente tratar de reducir el mal uso del número de emergencias en cuanto a resultados, porque lo que dice Marisol es, bueno, ya venimos implementando programas de educación pública hace ya varios años, y si es posible presentar resultados con respecto a la eficacia, al éxito de estos programas de educación pública para reducir el mal uso. No.
Por mi parte, no tengo esos datos.
Laurie, do you know whether in the US there are any metrics to kind of show the effectiveness of these education programs?
We do not. We don't have any of those metrics to show the effectiveness of it. However, we do have or can provide resources to help with that anyone that wants to build their programs or providing the right message. I think it's just a matter of really getting out there into the community, and it's going to be a repetitive process. We've been doing this, the educating about 911 since the system was, started back in 1968. So, I mean, you really have to continue that effort and ingrain it into these people. We started at a very early age. I'll even go into the preschools and talk to preschool kids about 911 and how to actually dial that number and what it means to dial that number. But and education programs go all the way through the high schools, and reaching out to the community for community events, and just take every opportunity that you can and just keep talking about it and don't stop.
Great. Holly?
To echo Lori's sentiments, no, we don't have any empirical evidence to state the effective or to validate the effectiveness of public education programs. We have a collective, at least in Ontario, the province that I live in, they have a collaborative training network for public safety trainers or training officers that share information and experiences, but and materials, but that's about as far as we've gotten. There's been no call for empirical evidence, although I'm sure everybody would like to, but there just aren't any resources to put toward it at this point.
No, but at least I think it's interesting and important to have this mechanism of exchange between people who are doing these kind of campaigns to see what works or what is better for certain targeted audiences, what channels to use, what messages are more effective. I think that at least to have that mechanism is a good idea, and this is something that perhaps we could replicate in the group. So thank you for bringing that up, Holly. Then we have a question from Gary Almeida del CISEQ 911, and the question is in Spanish. So again, Lori and Holly, please go to the interpretation channel so that you can listen to this question in a good English. Gary pregunta si respecto a lo que es el servicio de telefonía fija, no celular, telefonía fija, si existen estrategias aplicadas para disminuir el mal uso del número de emergencia. Porque creo que estamos como, ya hablamos más que nada de celular, pero es verdad que en algunos países todavía se usan las líneas fijas y si hay alguna estrategia específica para ese tipo de líneas. Who goes first?
I can go first.
Okay, great.
Honestly, we really don't have a specific applied strategy for landlines specifically. And as a matter of fact, in the United States, we're seeing a major decline in landline calls anyway. So, there is a large concentration on dealing with cellular types of calls.
Understood. I guess like in Latin American countries, we still have, despite the fact that it's true, we also have this trend of growing numbers of cell phone lines and numbers, but we still have landlines. So I guess it's still an issue for us. But what can you say about this in Canada, Holly, or Christina in Europe?
So we are similar in Canada. We actually do have a national statistic on that, is that over 70% of our phone calls are coming from wireless devices now. So the landline and many of the landline-based infrastructure are coming through VoIP type service providers. So they are digital anyway, in which case location identification for those types of services is very limited. So the strategy, we have the same strategy for wireline and wireless.
Understood. Thank you, Holly. Christina, anything to add?
Pues en Europa tampoco hay una gran diferenciación entre las estrategias de telefonía fija frente al móvil. También, las estadísticas son más o menos iguales, del 70% de llamadas que vienen de la telefonía móvil. Lo que sí que hay en algunas ocasiones es la identificación de números, a lo mejor de un hospital al que tienen acceso personas con ciertas características que pueden llamar varias veces, algún teléfono público que esté situado en un área donde hay niños que suelen hacer bromas, ese tipo de tener un número que siempre aparece, que tiene detrás potencialmente un número de unas llamadas reiteradas de mal uso del número de emergencia.
Ok, entendido. Gracias, Cristina. Y acá tengo una pregunta de Antonio Hernández, a quien aprovecho para saludar porque no te saludé, Antonio, esta mañana. ¿Qué tal? Y Antonio, te pregunta a vos, Cristina, si en la Unión Europea tienen países que aplican un impuesto del 911 al ciudadano. Es decir, si cobran en el recibo telefónico este impuesto, uses o no el 911, y si la respuesta es sí, ¿qué tanto esta estrategia ha ayudado a reducir las llamadas por mal uso? ¿Y qué tan factible crees vos que en América Latina se puede aplicar este impuesto al 911?
El número de emergencias único al 112 es gratuito para todos los ciudadanos y no se cobra ningún impuesto por llamar al 112, y los centros 112 se suelen financiar por pues el presupuesto general de la región o del país. No hay un porcentaje en ninguna de las facturas de telefonía de los usuarios utilizadas para el 112. Suele estar dentro de los presupuestos generales, igual que para otros servicios.
Entendido. Y yo aprovecho para preguntarte si aquellos países en donde como sanción hay una multa pecuniaria, por lo general, ¿cómo se gestiona ese dinero que se recolecta? ¿Se recolecta por una agencia aparte? ¿Lo recolecta el propio sistema? Por ejemplo, no sé si estuviste ayer, pero ayer, por ejemplo, Costa Rica comentaba que las multas pecuniarias, ese dinero se utiliza, tiene que ir dirigido a financiar campañas de concientización y de capacitación sobre el buen uso del número. Y no sé, en la Unión Europea, los países que sí tienen una multa pecuniaria, ¿cómo, o sea, o por lo menos algún ejemplo de qué es lo que se hace con ese dinero que se recolecta, quién lo recolecta, qué se hace? El micrófono, Cristina, estás en mute.
A pesar de tantas teleconferencias, todavía seguimos teniendo el mismo problema. Lo siento. La verdad es que depende mucho de cada país. Lo que en la mayoría va por vía judicial y se cobra como una multa aparte, o sea, no va directamente a algo específico.
Ok, listo. Bueno, a ver, creo que ya siendo, a ver, las 10:49, ok, sí, ya deberíamos estar in the fourth part of our panel with our final thoughts and comments about this topic. So let's go ahead now, Holly, if you can share with us your main takeaways or your final comments about this topic. What would you like participants to take away from your presentation and from this topic?
So the first one is, in our experience of transitioning to IP-based 911 service, the volume of hangups and dropped calls increased exponentially once we went to IP, and that was simply due to the time on the analog system. Those calls never made it from the switch to the call answering position. In IP, because that happens in milliseconds, now they make it. So we had a huge debate on agencies wanted, well, what do we do with those calls? We have to have a standard operating procedure. And the ILEX response was, well, you didn't even know those calls existed before. Why do you care now? So there's still some discrepancy of some agencies choose to deal with them all. And in those cases, that's where the text back programs or the automated services, if location information comes in or a callback number, they attempt. If nothing comes in, well, you can't do anything. So they just get screened. Awareness is building. Vendors are now finally stepping in to develop some tools to help address some of the misuse, to help identify them, but we're not there yet. For the Canadian experience, while statistics are starting to be developed, there's still a large vacuum, and there is no imperative at the federal level to make any kind of coordinated effort happen yet. So we are lobbying the federal government hard. We have been for about 5 years, and we will continue to do so, to find an entity that's interested in public safety, because it's all risk, of course. But NG911 is a critical first step in standardizing the technology, first of all, so that we can actually data share, because the NENA I3 standard has facilities baked into it to accommodate data sharing, so you can significantly reduce the cost of custom interfaces and the translation tools needed to share information between agencies. So that's a critical first step. And then based on standards and best practices for data sharing, we can start developing a collective knowledge from a national perspective. Even if we don't have a federal sponsor, at least we can do things on a regional and provincial basis. Again, it comes down to politics. It's not the technology that's the stumbling block. But then we have better facilities to start conversations between provinces and territories and the regional level to, what's the word, educate about the necessity for the statistics and why they're important, so that we can build the collective intelligence.
Okay, thank you for those final thoughts, Holly. So let's move now to Christina, so that she can share also her final comments or main takeaways about this panel.
Pues yo quería destacar sobre todo la importancia de las estadísticas, que para ello primero hay que tener una clasificación que sea común para todos los centros de emergencia del país, para que pueda ser comparable o lo más común posible. Luego tener unos procedimientos que sean, vamos, para tener estos datos para cada llamada, que sea posible el saber si ha sido finalmente un mal uso o no, porque algunas veces depende de la organización del país. Si, por ejemplo, se tiene un primer centro de emergencia de recepción de llamadas, que lo que hace es redireccionar esa llamada a la policía o a la ambulancia, muchas veces ese feedback de qué ha pasado con esta llamada, al final era alguien que era una emergencia de verdad, no lo era, no se tiene, o sea, se pierde un poco la información cuando se va trasladando la llamada de un servicio a otro. Entonces, esa centralización de la información también es importante para estas estadísticas. Utilizar la tecnología lo mejor posible, que también es un delicado equilibrio entre bloqueo. Siempre hay un riesgo de que en realidad justo en ese momento alguien tenga una emergencia detrás, entre el alargar las esperas con mensajes. Es siempre difíciles decisiones que hay que tomar, y hay que encontrar un equilibrio para que sea óptimo, para bajar el número de llamadas o de falsas, o sobre todo minimizar el tiempo que los operadores están utilizando el tiempo que tienen para este tipo de llamadas, en vez de estar gestionando llamadas de emergencia reales. Y luego, por último, aunque es un poco duro, pero yo sí que creo que la ley ayuda a tener algunas multas, o por lo menos tener esa posibilidad de bloquear una línea en un momento dado, aunque sean medidas no tan fuertes, pero sí que ayudan mucho a minimizar estas llamadas.
Listo. ¿Vamos? Great. Gracias, Cristina, for sharing your final insights on this topic. And so we now move on to Lori. So please, Lori, do us the honor of closing this panel with your final remarks.
Well, I was just very impressed with the panel overall, and it's interesting to see the similarities among different countries and the things that we experience, and finding that we share a lot of the same experiences, and we do have a common understanding of the issues. One thing that I'm taking away from this is the need really for those statistics. Like Christina said, how important it is to have those statistics to be able to identify trends and to be able to identify those needs and be able to take action on those needs. And also it's going to help, it helps with making legislative change and being able to, prove your needs with legislation and for funding. So that's really all I have to end this with, and just thank you again for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you to Christina and to Holly for doing this. It has been a great honor to be able to moderate this panel. And thank you to all participants for keeping this